4 nights and 1 morning. That is all the time 2 people spend together in this story. A lonely, daydreaming young man in Saint Petersburg, and a young woman he finds crying in the dark by a bridge one evening. He realizes he loves her before he even learns her name, almost from the first night. But her heart already belongs to someone else. This short novel may be the gentlest and most sorrowful thing Dostoevsky ever wrote, startlingly tender, even to readers who know only his later, darker novels. You will not be able to say whether the ending is happy or sad, because somehow it manages to be both at once. Let me tell you the story. Fyodor Dostoevsky was born in 1821 in Moscow, the son of a hospital doctor. When he wrote White Nights, he was only 26 years old, still a relatively new figure in Russian letters. His first novel, Poor Folk, had brought him great praise, with the influential critic Vissarion Belinsky reportedly hailing him as a new Gogol, but the works that followed had received a much cooler reception from critics. White Nights was published in 1848 in the pages of the journal Otechestveniya Zapiski. This period falls among the freest and most hopeful years of Dostoevsky's life, a young writer only newly known in the literary circles of St. Petersburg, who had not yet been exiled to Siberia, who had not yet stood before a firing squad, who had not yet drowned in the gambling debts that would define so much of his later life and reputation. Perhaps that is why this story carries a sadness so pure and tender compared to his later work, almost entirely free of cruelty. Dostoevsky gave the story its own subtitle, From the Memoirs of a Dreamer, which hints at its tone from the very first page. The narrator lives less in real events than in the world inside his own head. The book also reflects the young Dostoevsky's own strange affection for the streets, canals, and white nights of St. Petersburg, so much so that the city itself feels like a third character in the story. The title comes directly from a real seasonal phenomenon. Because of the city's northern latitude, the sky at midsummer never fully darkens, staying in a long twilight for much of the night, and residents of the city treated these luminous nights as the most poetic stretch of the year, wandering the streets and riverbanks nearly without sleep. That gentle, hopeful period did not last. Only a year after this story was published, Dostoevsky was arrested for belonging to a circle of friends who discussed forbidden social and political ideas, sentenced to death, and actually stood before a firing squad in a public square before his sentence was commuted at the very last moment to exile and hard labor in Siberia. So White Night sits right on the threshold between one of the brightest, freest periods of its author's life and a far darker chapter that was about to begin.
The novella itself follows exactly that same rhythm. Its sections are simply titled The First Night, The Second Night, The Third Night, The Fourth Night, and Morning, as though time itself were the book's own heartbeat. The story's narrator is a young man whose name we never learn. He lives alone in St. Petersburg, with no real ties to anyone, and treats the streets and buildings of the city almost like friends, even the walls of his own room. One evening, he comes across a young woman crying, leaning against the railing of a bridge. Her name is Nastenka, a diminutive of Anastasia. The narrator protects her from a man harassing her, and a strange, fragile closeness begins between them. As he tells his own story, the young man admits that he has spent his years in Petersburg without a single real conversation with anyone, wandering the city purely through imagination, and calls himself, for exactly that reason, a dreamer, a man more at home in his own imagination than in the company of others. Nastenka tells him her own story. She lives with her blind grandmother, a woman so anxious about losing her that she once pinned her own hem to Nastenka's dress to keep her close. Nastenka once fell in love with a lodger who rented a room in their home, a man who left the city on business a year ago, promising to return within the year and marry her, and whom she has waited for at that same bridge every evening since. Listening to her story, the narrator sees the depth of his own loneliness more clearly than ever. Over 4 nights, they meet at the same bridge, talk for hours, and come to trust one another. On the 3rd night, Nastenka even asks him to deliver a letter to her missing lover. The narrator eventually cannot hold back and confesses his feelings to Nastenka. She, in turn, begins to feel something for him too, perhaps starting to believe that the man she loved has forgotten her and is not coming back, and begins to imagine a new life at the narrator's side. I will not describe what happens at the end of the fourth night and the morning that follows, because Dostoevsky wraps those few hours in a tension that will hold your breath while you read. I will only say that the story ends on a heartbreaking choice, one that lands in the very same moment as the shortest, most intense happiness the narrator will ever know, joy and loss arriving in the same breath.
What keeps White Nights alive today, a century and a half after it was written, has less to do with its plot than with how it is told. Dostoevsky would go on to fill his great novels with that same inward, almost confessional voice, and here we see it tried out for the first time in its purest form. The dreamer, the narrator calls himself, is an early sketch of a type of character who would recur throughout Russian literature, people cut off from real life and living instead inside their own heads. The tension between the narrator's private daydreams and the real world outside them is a feeling anyone living alone in a big city, with no company but a phone or an imagination, comforting themselves through the day, can still recognize today. The story quietly asks what a happy ending actually means. Can a few hours of pure happiness given to someone else be worth the rest of a lifetime? Or is that only a comforting lie we tell ourselves? Dostoevsky leaves the question unanswered. Perhaps that is the story's most lasting quality. It contains no great tragedy. Nobody dies. Nobody is ruined. And yet it makes a small, quiet sadness impossible to forget. The story reached English readers largely through the work of Constance Garnett, the translator who introduced much of Russian literature, from Tolstoy to Chekhov, to Western audiences in the early 20th century, which means the text available to English readers today is itself a translation from the original Russian. White Nights has been adapted for film many times over, including Italian, Russian, French, Iranian, and Indian productions. One of the best known is the Italian film directed by Luchino Visconti in the late 1950s, starring Marcello Mastroianni. Another notable version was made in France by Robert Bresson in the early 1960s. That so many countries, in so many languages, have returned to this same small story suggests just how universal its themes of loneliness and waiting really are. When you hear Dostoevsky's name, you probably think first of thick, dark novels like Crime and Punishment, The Brothers Karamazov, or The Idiot, all of which you can also find on this channel. But White Nights came long before those enormous books, written in a younger hand that had not yet known exile, prison, or the gambling table. A small story with an outsized heart. We have covered White Nights, but to feel the true power of this short, sorrowful story, you need to hear each of its 4 nights unfold in Dostoevsky's own sentences, at his own pace. If you would like to listen to the complete book as an audiobook, you will find the link in the description. Do not miss Dostoevsky's other great novels on this channel as well. Subscribe so you do not miss the next video. Until then, like Nastenka's nameless friend through those nights, treasure whatever brief happiness comes your way.